Welcome to the webinar. This is a Fearless Security webinar on risk management, concepts, and structure. I'm just going to start by talking about fear, uncertainty, and doubt versus the facts, and what risks are and how they're composed and how we deal with risks. And then I'm going to talk about fearless security, our standard of practice, and the approach that we take in helping others manage their risks. So, even the words push fear. We're under threat. We're vulnerable, under attack. It was an APT, which I like. That was apt. It was an apt threat there. It was a virus. It was the Chinese. We're at risk. This is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's presented to induce, or whether intentionally or not, these properties that trigger bad decisions in many cases. It's our belief at Fearless Security that facts bring clarity. So, what is a threat? Well, a threat in the definitional scheme that we use is an actor, nature, a person, or a group of people, typically that might accidentally or intentionally do harm to you or whatever it is you're protecting. Of course, we're always vulnerable. That's just life. We're all going to die eventually. We could be hit by lightning or a car or a heart attack. That's just how it is. And I should note that certainly in the internet today, attacks are almost never successful. And I say that, people say, well, but we get successfully attacked all the time, and that's true. But if you look at the number of attempts undertaken compared to the number that actually succeed, it's almost minuscule. It's common that if you put a computer out on the internet, within the first hour, you'll get at least hundreds, maybe thousands of attempts. And of those, a relatively few will succeed. So it's really not the case that the attackers are always winning. It's the case that they're almost never winning, but they just do things in large enough volume, so eventually they win here and there. The advanced persistent threat, that's a term of art that's come out recently to indicate something that's always been around. It's always been the case that there are actors that work hard over time to try and achieve their objectives. It's only that we're starting to talk about it more and more enterprises are facing these threats as the world changes. And by the way, yeah, sure, I'm sure the Chinese do attack people in the U.S. and the rest of the world, but you know what? People in the U.S. and the rest of the world attack Chinese as well. So it's just the nature of the environment that people are malicious at times, and that's how it is. In fact, I'll tell you, most people that I ask can't even give any definition at all of risk. And there certainly isn't a widely agreed definition. So what we have here is largely fear of the unknown. So let's try and get to know it. I'll start out, like I said, there's no consensus around what is risks. There are different definitions. You might note anytime somebody proposes a definition of risk, if you ask them what are the units of measure for that thing, you'll find that there are a wide variety of units of measure. So it indicates we don't agree if we can't agree on the units of measure. And if people don't know what the units of measure are, then maybe they don't really know what they're talking about. The term is used widely with inconsistent meaning. I call it the R word, or another way I put it is it's a four-letter word that ends in K, one that we shouldn't be using to excess. I would say try to avoid using it unless you're sure you know what you're talking about. And I'll admit that I overuse it just as everybody else does. It's a commonly used word. But even the word is unknown, so we maybe even fear the word because we don't know what it means. I'll take a simplistic view, and this is the view I generally take. I think in terms of decisions we make every day in everything we do. Every decision we ever make has the potential for benefits and the potential for pitfalls. And generally, people call the pitfalls risks and the benefits rewards. In essence, we take risks to gain rewards, and especially in information security and many other similar areas, it's not really widely recognized and understood that risks are ways to gain rewards. That is, we take them. We don't always avoid them. We're not always trying to get rid of them. In fact, they're different views of the same thing. Here's an interesting view of risk using a tool called Decider that we use. The horizontal, left to right, is favorability. So if it's further to the left, it's very unfavorable. It's a yes-no decision, says we shouldn't do it. If it's to the right, it's very favorable. It means we should do it. The vertical up and down is importance. That's the magnitude of the consequence. So if it's close to the top, that means it's more important. And if it's near the bottom, it means it's less important. So just by looking at this picture, you can understand sort of structurally that the benefits are up to the right. That's important things that are very favorable. The pitfalls are up to the left. That's important and unfavorable. There are these unknowns in the middle. They're important. We need to maybe figure them out. And then at the bottom, the stuff that's not as important, it's probably not so important. We don't have to worry about it that much. This particular tool also leads to a center of gravity. Now, I want to point out that the picture is different and changeable between and within individuals. So I might have the same picture today, but a different picture tomorrow. And you and I might have different pictures because our views are different. And these unknown areas, these are uncertainty about the future, things we're just really unsure of, and presumably they're important. And this particular decision, without any of the details, is risky because it's so uncertain, and there's a balance in it. Now, I'm going to pop up another decision. This is a part of the Keiretsu Forum due diligence process. It's a published process. And this is just a sample. This is a set of key questions and verifications. And so these are the various factors in this decision. And just by looking at this picture, you can see that this is probably not a very good investment decision to make. But I'm just going to move things around. Suppose it looked like this, right? And we had all these things that were unfavorable. Maybe this just isn't as important. And, maybe this is, we're not that sure about it. All of a sudden, it looks like a much more favorable decision. Also note that different people will place different factors in different places. And what that means is that I might want to take risks that you wouldn't, and you might want to take risks that I wouldn't. So I hope that brings some notional clarity to understanding what I'm talking about. Now, I run a business, and I take risks to gain rewards. In our last webinar, we talked about duty to protect, and I have defined duties to protect. I know what they are. I've assessed consequences of various kinds of failures. Failures, that is, to meet the defined duties to protect. And for high consequences, I consider the threats, but I don't have that many high consequences. Mostly, I try to architect away the exploitable vulnerabilities. So there are plenty of vulnerabilities. Somebody could, put a gun to my head. I'm not going to architect that away. Probably if you put a gun to my head, I'll do almost anything you say until I get away from you, and then I'll call the police or whoever. I decide to take risks or not based on rewards and on the risk that's left over. I look at various interdependencies. I try to consider if I do this and I depend on that thing over there, what's it going to get me? So, for example, I don't favor storing client information in cloud infrastructure because it's too interdependent on things that are out of my control. I also try to match surety to risk. So if something is perceived as having a greater potential negative consequence, I try to use something that's more certain to protect it. And I also try to minimize my effort in doing this because the time I spend managing risk is time I don't spend doing useful work. Not that managing risks isn't useful work, but it doesn't produce money and doesn't save money. And certainly in terms of a job or in terms of a business, those are largely the objectives. So let's talk about how we do it fearlessly. Now, fearless security uses a standard of practice, and a standard of practice is not a standard and it's not a practice. That's the first thing to understand. What it is, so a standard, that's something you follow. You just do what it says, right? And a practice is something that you do. A standard of practice is sort of a minimum baseline of what you do. And we use the standard of practice to help experts make better decisions. And for example, we try to ask a reasonably comprehensive set of questions about protection. We try to codify the responses consistently in a language that we've defined, and we put definitions of terms in where it's unclear. We try to provide guidance as to the decisions using a basis for each decision that's predefined and identify variations. So, it's not a rote process. It's a process where an expert looks at a situation and says, well, Normally I'd do this, but if your situation is slightly different, or if there's a good reason not to do that, or if you just don't favor it, we'll find another way. Um, it works and we use it, but when it doesn't seem to apply, we adapt. And sometimes things aren't the way you originally think they might be, and you have to adapt. But what we try to do is adapt the standard of practice over time. So if there's an unusual circumstance, it's a one-off, we'll just make a variance. But if it's something that we say, gee, that's going to happen again, we modify the standard of practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about the elements of the standard of practice that apply to risk management. But along the way, I just want to bring up the tool that we use to deal with it. This is our tool for dealing with the standard of practice. You can see this is the approach. For example, how do you do risk management? Essentially, the decision here is, are you going to use the model we provide or some other model? And whatever you pick, you just put it over in the as is and say, that's my decision. Our general view is if a different model is required by external mandates, then use it. And if not, you should use the one that we've provided. So if you don't have anything better, use this one. Here's the next question. What risk assessment process do you use? And I'll just show you there are a set of options up here. And there's a decision. And the decision that we use, I'm just going to change the window size so you can see it more clearly. The decision we use about risk assessment has to do with threat and consequence. So if you're in the high threat, high consequence area, you'll be using systems analysis, managing it continuously, have top management involved, reassess continuously, make sure you have a high level of maturity in your organization and such. On the other hand, low threat, low consequence, lightweight initial periodic reassessments, maybe a minimal due diligence process is fine, vulnerability tests and things like that. So they're just different approaches for different places in the space. Now I'm going to move this out of the way. And I'll tell you, I usually start in the middle with a protection posture assessment or a lightweight initial assessment. And that's what Fearless largely does for its clients. We do these initial assessments largely to figure out what the space looks like. If we find that you need something that's a higher quality, the initial assessment will tell you. The initial assessment is quick. It takes about 10 days from start to finish. And it's relatively inexpensive. So I figure it's better to find out quickly and not pay too much in finding out. And then if you need more, you do more. And if you don't need more, you're good to go. When talking about evaluating consequences, that's another aspect of the process. There are different methods for measuring things that people call risks. I'm just going to bring back the table here, or the program. And here's the typical set of approaches. There's a 10-level risk model that a lot of people use. They rate things from 1 to 10. We favor the 3-level model, and the reason we favor it is because protective measures really don't come in 10 different levels of quality. We find that there are sort of low surety, medium surety, and high surety protective measures. So if you're making a decision and you only have sort of 3 architectural choices, it doesn't make sense to have a model that computes things to 2 digits of accuracy. IEC 61508, this is commonly used in industrial control systems and related matters. This has frequency, probability, and such in one dimension, and then the consequences in another dimension. And there are actual numbers that they put on here. So if it's more than this often and more than this likely, how many times it happens, then it puts you in a particular category. A level of criticality and a level of likelihood. And then that defines it as risk level 3, according to that standard. So those are just different approaches to risk management that are commonly used. So we have a decision criteria. Our decision criteria is pretty straightforward. It says, depending on the particulars of your circumstance and your ability to do the analysis and such, you should pick one or the other of these methods. So that's how the standard of practice is. Like I said, I tend to use the 3-level approach because I don't find that there are enough alternatives to justify more of them. There's another issue that a lot of people tend not to recognize and or understand, and that's the design basis threat. In designing and architecting protection, there is the notion that we're designing based on some assumption or set of assumptions, and some of those assumptions are about threats. That is, the actors acting against us, humans, groups of humans, nature, and all the things that these produce. So when you try to assess this, you identify limits to funding, size, motive, skills, level of effort, and so forth, where they start out. If it's an insider who's been brought in by a foreign intelligence operation, that's a very different threat than a high school kid over the internet trying to do something. And different organizations face different sets of threats and may decide to defend or not defend against different threats. I mean, it's reasonable for most businesses to say we're going to ignore foreign intelligence threats. We're not going to be in the countering foreign intelligence business or in the defense against nuclear weapons. If you're worried about nuclear war, so you can pick what to defend against and what not to by identifying what your threat is designed to hit, is designed based on. And you don't have to win against them all the time, and you don't have to win against all of them. What you have to understand is that sometimes you'll lose, and try to consider what you're willing to lose under what circumstances. For example, do you really want to defend against your own government? Are you really going to try to outdo the NSA and their surveillance capabilities, or is the best way to fight that in the legal realm or in the political realm? So the design basis threat is this set of capabilities and intents that you assume for building your defenses. And notionally, if you fail to do this, if you don't have a design basis threat that you create and understand, what you're going to do is end up always defending against mystery, against, we don't really know what we're defending against. Oh, somebody came up with this idea. Oh, somebody can do that. And you'll fuse things together. You'll say, well, if I take the capability of this group and the capability of that group and the capability of the third group and combine them together, they can do all these things. But if we're defending against, all possible threats all the time, we're going to spend a lot of money and gain very little utility. That is, we take risks for benefits. We don't try to mitigate all risks because that doesn't bring the same benefits. In terms of vulnerability evaluation, it's fairly common for people to scan for known vulnerabilities. And I certainly do periodic scans, but I don't do it to find vulnerabilities. I do it to verify that protection is the way I think it's supposed to be. That is, the minutia of looking for every one of the potential vulnerabilities really has little value to the effectiveness of protection in most cases. It probably costs a substantial amount, maybe more than it's worth. It generates a false sense of insecurity in a lot of cases because it identifies lots of vulnerabilities that may never be actuatable by one of the threats that you're really concerned about. And of course, if nothing is found, then you have this false sense of security. You say, well, nothing was found, they must be safe. So another problem is a lot of organizations, when they do such a thing, it leads to a requirement to try to fix them all. And I mean all. So you have organizations that never fix everything, but spend lots of resources fixing relatively trivial vulnerabilities that don't have high consequence if they're exploited and are rarely exploited and can't realistically be exploited by the threats that they're concerned with to any substantial effect. So I only look when I have a reason to do so. Right? We do protection testing for high consequences in the context of a failure mode and in the context of a systems analysis. And we test the mechanisms we have in place to make sure they're doing what we think they're supposed to do, but we don't just scan for vulnerability. So normally we're talking about choices. There are only four choices or approaches to so-called risk that people talk about. There's risk acceptance, reduction, transfer, and avoidance. So acceptance, that means I'm willing to take the risk. I've decided to assume the risk for the benefits it brings. And in fact, I only choose an alternative if I think the rewards are worth it. There's reduction. So I mitigate risks architecturally. I try not to mitigate risks by putting specific protective mechanisms in for specific attack mechanisms or threat actors. I try to have an architecture that will sustain, so I don't have to spend all my time in mitigation and play this game of attack and defense continuously. I'd rather have something that they just don't succeed at, and every once in a while I have to change it to stay ahead of whoever's trying to get to me. Transfer, I do have insurance for limited things, but mostly the insurance is to meet requirements of customers. I don't need to insure, as far as I can tell, against the information related uh, risks that I have. I don't find that transfer to be useful. So what happens is, de facto, I transfer it to myself. That is, as an owner, as a shareholder, I assume the risk. So it's accepted by transferring it to me. And then there's avoidance. There are things that I just don't do, right? So a good example is, I talked earlier, I don't store client information in other people's infrastructure. I don't do that because I think whatever those risks are, it's not worth it. I'd rather avoid those risks. It doesn't cost much to hold the data myself. The rewards are that every time somebody breaks into some site or you hear something in the news, it doesn't have any effect on my infrastructure. So I don't have to worry about lots and lots of things that could happen out there, and about the many people that I depend on if I do that. So this table at the bottom right sort of codifies the general approach. But I got to tell you, I don't really feel failure. People ask, what keeps you up at night? The answer is, I sleep fine. I'm focused on success. It's not about fear. It's about the nature of things. Don't be afraid to fail. Think about how you can succeed and move forward. So how does all this remove fear? Well, fear comes from the perceived threats and vulnerabilities, and it reflects your uncertainty about the future. So by using a process that's sort of built out and thought through, we believe it's reasonable and prudent to do these things. And so that means we're being reasonable. We're being prudent. The consequence analysis allows selection of what to pay more and less attention to. So if there's somebody who's going to go out and try and deny services by accessing my web server lots and lots of times, I will suffer the consequence. I'm just not going to try to mitigate it. I don't care. It won't do that much harm. The threats and the design basis threat, that limits the set of actors we decide to take into account. And that, of course, reduces the set of things we have to worry about. And we recognize that, if a military organization or a paramilitary group decides to, take guns and enter our facilities, they will probably succeed. And we'll depend on the police and law enforcement and the government to deal with the effects afterwards. And we're just not going to have an army to protect ourselves. You might want one. It's up to you. We test protection effectiveness, but not vulnerabilities. And we make choices from known alternatives for defined and documented reasons. So we understand why we make the decisions, and we document them. This leads to understanding and acceptance as opposed to fear. So we know what we've decided to risk and why, and we take risks to gain rewards. Of course, that's not all there is to it, but if you want more about this, we can discuss it in next month's webinar, which is, there are some subtleties. I'm going to turn off the recording and open the session to questions.